All right, folks, so we are back in the shop today. We're going to be doing some bow building. I was asked to write an article for Outdoor Life about how to build a bow, and I figured, well, if I'm going to be building a bow and taking pictures, I might as well make a video as well. So this video is going to be very, very basic. This is going to be directed at people who are very new to bow building, people who have never built a bow before. And so we're going to go through everything, start to finish. We've got a hickory log here. It's relatively small diameter. I'm going to use a very basic toolkit, something that really anybody can get very cheaply. And we're going to talk about all the terminology. We're going to talk about why we do certain things that a lot of people will kind of gloss over in some of the more advanced videos. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump right on into it. The reason that I am choosing hickory for this build, there's a couple of reasons. One, it's very easy to get. If you're in the eastern US, you can find hickory from Florida to New York State and everywhere in between. Number two, it's a very tough wood. It's a very good wood for beginners. You can make some mistakes and still come out with a functional bow. And number three is you don't have to, with hickory, you don't have to cut this wood and wait years for this stuff to season, like you do with things like yew and osage and some of the top tier bow woods. With hickory, you could go out today, go out into the woods, cut a tree down and start making a bow. It's the grain interlocks, and so when you cut this stuff, normally what would happen is, like if I went and cut a piece of osage, took the bark and the sapwood off and started making a bow that same day, as that bow wood dries, it'll dry too rapidly and it'll cause cracks up and down the bow. It'll cause checks. Hickory will do that, but not nearly to the extent that other woods will. And so when hickory dries fast, it'll open up tiny little cracks, but they're kind of superficial. They don't really matter. And so what you can do is you can go out of the woods, you can cut a piece of wood, strip the bark off of it, rough a bow out of this stuff while it is sopping wet and green, and then you can actually force dry this stuff, and you could make a bow in less than 24 hours with hickory. Now this particular piece of wood that we're using right here, this is a piece of water hickory that I cut in Alabama, and I cut this one several years ago. And so this one's already pretty dry, but you could, if you wanted to, you can go out and cut a green tree, make a bow in just a day or two. All right, let's go over the tool selection that we're going to be using here. For this build, I wanted to go very, very simple on the tools. The main tool that I'm going to be using is my draw knife here. Now I get questions all the time about where can I get a draw knife? What kind of draw knife do I need? All of the knives that I use, except for one that was custom built for me, they're all old vintage Greenlee knives. This one has a 10-inch blade. I like a 10-inch. I would say go with a 10-inch if you can find one. Certainly don't go with anything less than 8 inches. I feel like with less than 8 inches, it's just hard to get around a big stave like this. These old vintage knives are heavy duty. They're thick, and you need something that's thick and heavy to stand up to the torque that you're going to be putting on these things during the bow building process. Now you can find these things on eBay for somewhere between 50 and 80 bucks usually, and they're good quality knives. Like I said, Greenlee, just get on eBay, type in Greenlee draw knife, and you should be able to find some of these things. And I'm sure there's other manufacturers of these things, these old vintage knives. This is what I have, and these have been around my place forever. These were probably my great uncle or grandfather, something like that. I don't know where they came from. They've just been around the house here. So we've got a draw knife, some sort of ruler. You don't have to have one of these fold out things, just a 1 foot regular ruler will work, just something for layout. We're going to be using a pencil, a chalk line, tape measure, some sort of big rasp. This is a farrier's rasp used for horses' hooves. You can get these from Three Rivers or any of the farm and ranch stores, horseshoeing supply, anything like that. These things are fantastic. And then some sort of hatchet or tomahawk or something like that for roughing out. Now, this is all you need to build this bow. To save time, I'm going to be using a power plane on the side. You'll see that in a minute. If you don't have that, it's not a problem. I've built hundreds of bows and I've used that like on two. So it's just a time saver. You don't need it. This is basically all you need right here. Very, very simple toolkit. All right, so let's get started. Now with this piece of wood, if you look down this piece of wood, you'll notice that it's got a little bit of a sweep kind of going this way. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this piece of wood so that that sweep is going down. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use this top, the part that's on top with that sweep going down like this, we're going to use this as what's called the back of the bow. Now the back is what is, when you're holding the bow, the back is actually facing away from you. The belly side of the bow is what's facing you or what's towards you as you're holding the bow. So we're going to have the back here, the belly down here. Now I'm going to take my draw knife and I'm going to take the bark and the cambium off of this piece of wood, being very careful not to dig into the actual wood. All I want to do is take the bark off of it, and then that very thin layer between the bark and the wood, that's called the cambium. We're going to take all of that stuff off, and then we're going to use our string line to pop a line right down the center of this, and then we're going to lay the bow out off of that center line. Now this is a great method for clean, straight wood like this hickory stave. Now if you have some other piece of wood that has some wiggle to it, the string line method is not going to work very well. I go into much greater detail over on my Patreon site. I've got a bunch of bow building videos on there, or the DVD set that I put out. So if you're working with wood that is not straight, there's some other methods, but we're not going to get into that in this video. So I'm going to start taking the bark and the cambium off of this. Set my tools over here. Now this bow building bench that I got here, I'm going to get some questions on this. These, you can get something, if you're going to get into bow building, you can get something very similar to this at stavemaster.com. They're great benches. But I mean, they're relatively expensive, and so if you're just going to be building a bow or two, you don't need this. All you need is a bench vise attached to a table, but if you're going to go that route, you need to make sure that it is very, very sturdy. Because you will, if it's just mounted to a wooden bench or something, you will pull that thing all over your shop trying to get a bow built. And so throw you a couple of sacks of Quikrete or something up there to make it heavy, and go to town. So we're just going to use this bevel down. Again, being very careful not to get down into the wood. So you can get through the heavy bark, and then this brown stuff that you're seeing, that's the cambium. That's that layer underneath. Once you get the bulk of it off, you can turn your draw knife up, start using it like a scraper, and that'll help you get down through that stuff without digging into the wood itself. So I'm just going to clean up the very top of this thing, that top spine, and then I'm going to pop the line, because most of this stuff is going to go away. Now, if there's any little pin knots or anything like that, you need to be very careful, especially in this process, because if you're coming along with your draw knife and you hook one of those pin knots, you're going to dig down into the grain. Now, with hickory, like I said, it's a great beginner's wood. It'll let you get away with some of those mistakes, but it's best if you can leave them intact, or leave the grain intact around them. So if you're doing this with hickory that you cut in the springtime when the bark or when the sap's up, all you've got to do, you could just peel the bark off of this stuff, and then you have a pristine wood underneath that bark for your back. This is, if you cut it in the winter time or after the wood's dry like this, it's a lot more work. right, so if you did happen to gouge down into this, if you are using hickory, it's not a huge deal most of the time. All you got to do is just kind of smooth those things out, and a lot of times it helps if you come at it from across the grain, because if you come at it straight with the grain, it's going to want to run that grain out. It'll kind of hook under the grain, and the grain will just keep going. And so if you come at it at an angle, a lot of times you can cut those off and just kind of smooth them out, or you can do it with sandpaper if your wood's dry. Got a little gouge here. All right, so we've got the bark and cambium for the most part off of the what's going to be the back of this bow. So now we're just going to lay this up here. We're going to pop a line right down the middle of this thing. All right, so I've got the center line popped on this stave. The back is ready to go, and we're ready to start laying this bow out. Now we're gonna make this thing 64 inches overall, which for my draw length, which is about 29 inches, that's perfect. If you are, if you've got a shorter draw, say 26, 27, or a longer draw, you need to adjust a little bit. What I do is take my draw length, multiply it by about 2.24 or something like that, and that's going to give you a good starting point for the overall length of your bow. So there's a couple of different ways to lay this out. If you get my book, I'm going to show you a little bit different way in there than I'm going to show you in this video. But for this, since this video is targeted towards very new bowyers, we're just going to lay this thing out perfectly symmetrical. And so I've already cut this wood 64 inches, and so 64 inches total length. We're just going to come to 32. We're going to make a mark right there. We're going to go up 2 inches and down 2 inches, and that is going to be our handle section. Now out from that, we're going to come out another, say, 2 inches or so. Doesn't matter, you can go 3 inches, and this is going to be your fades, the area where your narrow handle flares out into the full width of your limbs, and then also the depth of your handle kind of fades down into the final thickness of the limbs. So we're going to go up 2 inches from that, down 2 inches, 2, 4, 6, 8. So we're going to have an 8-inch stiff riser section in this bow. And at this point, the reason that I'm laying it out symmetrically like this, like normally what I would do is I would shift my handle down towards the bottom limb just a little bit, which is going to make a shorter bottom limb and a little bit longer top limb. I'm not going to go into why you'd want to do that in this video. But the reason I'm laying out symmetrically like this is because you can, when we get into the tillering process, you can flip this bow end over end, and it doesn't matter which is the top, and so it gives you more flexibility as we move on with this bow building process. Okay, so we've got our 8-inch riser section laid out here. Now I'm going to come to the knock ends, and I'm going to put a couple of marks on either side of this line that we popped. I like very fine knocks. That's one of the mistakes that people make when they get into bow building, is they make their knocks way too big. When people shoot self bows that are poorly made, they have what's called a lot of hand shock, and so when you shoot that bow, it'll rattle in your hands, and it's just uncomfortable to shoot. They're sluggish, they're inefficient, they're not very fun to shoot at all. That hand shock comes from energy that's left over in the bow, and a lot of that energy is because there's just a bunch of mass in the limb tips. And so anything that you can do to reduce mass in the limb tips will go a long way in making this bow much funner to shoot, much more efficient, much sweeter. And so I make my knocks pretty small. I'd say about 3/8 of an inch wide on the end. I wouldn't go any wider than a 1/2 inch, and you can go on down to very, very fine. And some people make what's called needle nocks or pin nocks, which are incredibly fine nocks. So I'm going to go about a 1/4 inch on each side of this line, make a mark, and then so that's going to give us a 1/2 inch knock, which we're going to thin that down or narrow that down here a little bit later. So I'm going to come down, let's see, so these are 28-inch limbs. I'm going to come down 14 inches. We're going to split this limb into quarters. So we're going to go 14, we'll come down 7, and then 21, and we'll go do the same thing on this limb. 7, 14, 21. So I'm going to go find a straight edge to help me lay this limb out. You should be able to round one up somewhere. Oh, here's one right here. Forgot to mention this in the tools. All right, so for this bow, we're going to make this thing about 1.5 inches or so wide. That's going to be the widest part of our limb. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to, from this handle section here, the top of our handle, we're going to make this maybe 1 inch wide. We're going to flare out to that 1.5 inches. We're going to hold that 1.5 inches till the mid limb, and then we're going to taper into our 1/2 inch nocks. Very, very simple design. So what I'm going to do is come off each side of this line about 3/4 of an inch. Okay, I'm going to find a straight edge. And I'm just going to connect. If you can find somebody to help you with this part, you'll be ahead of the game. Got our one limb profile on there. Now we'll do the other one. There we go. Got the profile drawn on the back. So we've got our handles about a little over 1 inch or so wide. We flare out over 2 inches to that 1.5 inches. The limb holds that 1.5 inches all the way out to about mid limb, and then it tapers down to 1/2 inch nocks. It's a symmetrical design. It's exactly the same on both sides. So when we move forward, we can flip this thing over. Depending on which limb we want to be the top, just gives you a little bit more flexibility. So now what we need to do is basically take off everything that is outside of this profile front to back. Now you can do this with a hatchet, you could do it with a power plane, a bandsaw if you have one. The tool that you use is very critical. I'm going to use a hatchet to start just to kind of show you what you would do, but then I'm going to move to a hand plane just to save some time. So when you're working on this front to back profile, cutting this profile out, the biggest thing that you want to watch out for is that the sides of your limbs need to be square with the back, or relatively square. Now that's kind of a hard thing to judge, seeing as how this crown or this stave is round. You don't have a square back, and so you have what's called a crown to it, that natural outside curvature of that tree. And so what you're gonna have to do is just kind of average across that and keep your sides square to that, instead of having like a trapezoidal type shape when you get done with this thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and just move to the power plane, knock some of this stuff off. We'll get the front to back profile cut out, and that's gonna put us into a position to start moving on with actually moving or removing some belly wood so that we can get these limbs actually bending. All right, so we're getting down pretty close to our lines on this front to back profile. Now, I've got a lot of meat back here. We just need to knock off a bunch of this stuff. And so what I'm gonna do right now is just draw kind of a preliminary line on the sides of the limb, the side of the bow. And we'll just take whatever tools you have access to. If you have a bandsaw, that's great. You could even do a lot of it with a skill saw. Or if you don't have anything with a draw knife, eat your Wheaties, because it's a lot of work. So where's my pencil? So I'm not gonna make any measurements here. I'm just gonna eyeball everything. So I'm gonna take my handle marks and just transfer them over here to the side so we can see them on both sides. And then down here in the limb, I'm just gonna take my finger and just come down to, we'll say for right now, 3/4 of an inch or so. That'll give us plenty of room. So if we go a little deep, it's not a big deal. Draw a line there. Draw a line here. And then in the handle, we'll go obviously a little deeper. Couple 2 inches or so. Doesn't really matter. Draw some rough fades on there, something like that. Do the same thing on this side. These lines are just a reference. These are really not important at all. Just gonna give us a reference line for knowing where our limbs are, and so that we don't get things messed up and end up taking off too much where we're not supposed to. All right, so everything from there down needs to go away, and then it's gonna kind of start looking like a bow. One quick way to do this is to take a chop saw and come in on just outside your fades, go down a little bit, or you can do it with a handsaw, make a couple of slots, and then you can take a pry bar or something to stick in there and just kind of wedge a big hunk of this wood off the belly. Blade is incredibly dull. Grief. Right there, make a good handle or something. Hatchet handle. So we've got this thing cut down right almost to our lines on our back profile. We've got quite a bit of the belly wood knocked off. This thing's kind of starting to look like a bow. Still a lot of wood that's got to come off. So what I've done is you just use whatever tools you have at your disposal to get it down to these lines. So you can use a bandsaw, a hatchet, power plane, skill saw, even if you're skilled enough to use that. Basically whatever you can do to get this thing down to the lines. And then you want to move into a rasp and do some fine tuning. So I'm going to use my my farrier's rasp, and I'm going to take these sides right on down to the lines that we drew, that 1.5 inch width on our limbs. Pretty doggone good right there. So if you look down that piece of wood, that's front to back, that's basically the shape of the bow, other than the handle section here. It's still full width. So we'll go ahead and dish this out a little bit, go down to our lines that we drew. Probably gonna have to move back to the draw knife for that a little bit. All right, so that's pretty good. We've got the back profile right on down to basically everything. Handle, limbs, limb tips, right on down to the 1/2 inch nocks. I'm gonna go ahead and just smooth these sides up a little bit with the fine side of my rasp, and then we'll be ready to draw some lines. All right, that is good enough. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna draw the depth of our handle, we're gonna draw the fades on here, and we're gonna draw our approximate limb thickness. On this, I'm probably gonna start about a 1/2 inch. A 1/2 inch deep, that's gonna give us some room for error. The limbs are actually gonna end up probably less than 3/8. So if we go with 1/2 inch, that's gonna give us an 1/8 inch to play with. I'm gonna take my pencil for my handle here. I'm going to just get a little bit of a set with my thumb right there, about 2 inches or so. Make a little mark, come down here, make a little mark, come to the other side, do the same thing. Now if you have a compass that you can put a pencil in, like a drawing compass, that I use that quite a bit in my bow building. I'm not going to use it on this build because I'm trying to do this with as few tools as possible. But if you have one, they come in very handy because you can set the depth and then there's no guesswork at all. Okay, so on the limbs, I'm going to come about a 1/2 inch deep. Just going to draw a line right on down the limb, all the way to the nock. Same thing on this side. This is where that compass really comes in handy. All right, so now what we're going to do is going to take our lines that we marked on the back for our handle and our riser. We're going to transfer those over to the side so we can see them. And now we're going to find something that's round. It doesn't matter what it is. This is an old chop saw blade. It's probably 10.5 or so inches diameter. Just get you something that's about this size. If you want tighter fades or shorter fades, you can use something smaller like a paint can lid or something like that. If you want your fades to be longer, grab something bigger. I'm just going to use this to trace out my fades on here. I'm basically just lining it up with the end of the fade here, top of the handle here. Stick it on there so it crosses those two intersections. And scribe your line, like so. All right, there we go. So now, back to removing wood. Basically everything above this line is going to come off. And what we're going to shoot for, hopefully, is a fairly flat side on the belly. And if you were to take this limb and cut it into a cross section, as rectangular as you can get it. Now, you're not going to be able to get a perfect rectangle because this thing does have a, you have that rounded, that radius, the outside of the tree, that's the crown of this stave. And so you're not going to get a perfect rectangle, but you can get pretty doggone close. All right, so I'm gonna work this right on down to the line. I'm gonna get it pretty close, and then I'll pick this up when I move to the rasp and start flattening this belly out and making it look like a bow. All right, so I'm down pretty doggone close to these lines with my draw knife. Now, the fades right here, those you can do those with a draw knife, but they're pretty hard to get in there and get that radius. And so the easiest way to do that, and I'm gonna cheat a little bit here, I'm gonna bring in a different tool that I didn't mention earlier, but the easiest way to do that is with a sharp, broad chisel like this. This is probably, I don't know, 1.5 inch wide chisel, but I'm gonna take it in here, I'm gonna put it at a little bit of an angle to the limb, and I'll give you a close-up, show you exactly what I'm talking about. But I'm just gonna chisel these fades out, and if you get a little bit of practice with this, you can actually be pretty doggone accurate with this and basically follow that line perfectly. So I'll find a hammer to show you exactly how to do that. So what you're gonna wanna do, you don't wanna put your chisel perfectly square to the bow. You wanna kick it to the side a little bit so that you have a little bit of an angle. We're gonna chisel this one, then we'll turn it the other way, chisel the other side, and then we'll do this one and this one. I'm going to start right here so you can see what I'm working on. And I'm going to do it a little bit at a time. I'm not going to try to take the whole bite at once. Oh, another very important thing, always use it bevel down. If you use it bevel up like that, it's going to want to dig into your wood and you're not going to be satisfied with the results. Pretty close. That's pretty doggone good. We can get the rest of that with a round rasp. Come and do this other side. And again, I tilted it this way, then kind of tilt it the other way. Nice. Do this one. Alright, so that looks very, very nice right there. We can just clean this up with the a rasp, and if you have one, a half round rasp like this works very nice. You have another tool I didn't tell you about earlier, but you can do it with a flat file if you need. Now, one thing I want to point out on this is you want a smooth transition in from your fade into your limb. You don't want an angle there. If you have it down and then have an angle right here, that's going to be a stress point right there. You need that nice smooth transition. All right, so day 2 working on this bow. So what we accomplished is we've got this, the belly side knocked off. It's kind of starting to look like a bow a little bit. Limbs are still very, very thick. They're probably 3/4 of an inch thick or so. We got the belly wood all the way down to that first line that I drew. Now what I've done on this side is I've gone ahead and drawn another line. Now this one is about 3/8 inch deep from the back of the bow, which is here. So this edge right here, come in about 3/8, draw another line just like we did before. Now this line, that's going to be pretty close to our finished limb thickness, and so when we're going to this line, you need to be very careful that you don't go below that. So I did this just like the time that I did before. I'm going to flip it over here and just kind of do the same thing, so about 3/8 inch deep. And if you have a compass where you can put a pencil in there or a fine tip Sharpie and get it exact, that's going to help, but I'm going to go ahead and do it without that. Got that side. And we'll get this side. We're going to take our trusty worn out chop saw blade and draw our fades on. And we're basically going to repeat what we did before. We're going to get down pretty close to this with our draw knife, and then I'm going to fine tune it with the rasp, getting right to the rasp. Now, on this last one, we kind of just flatten it off a little bit. On this one, what I want to do is I want to create like a ridge running down this limb. So right now the limb's about 3/4 of an inch thick all the way down. We redrew our lines at 3/8. So what I want to do is take my draw knife and my rasp, and the limb right now is flat. I want to come at this thing with my tool at an angle like this. So I'm going to take one edge off, I'm going to flip it to the other side, I'm going to come take the other edge off, and what that's going to do is create a, if we took this limb and took a cross section out of it, you're going to have 2 parallel sides, and then you're going to have a peak or a ridge running right down the middle. It's going to be shaped kind of like a house. Now what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to get very accurate on our sides. It's going to leave that ridge in the middle, and then as we're tillering it, we're going to start taking that ridge down and flattening that thing down. All right, so I've got this thing down pretty close to the line. It's probably about a 1/16 of an inch to the line all the way down. I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to do the other limb, and then we'll come back with the rasp and get it right down exactly to the line. And as long as we did a good job scribing our line or limb thickness on the same on each side, we should come out with a perfectly, or as close as you can get it to perfectly rectangular cross section on this thing. Of course, taking into account the crown on the back of this thing. And if we can do that, that's going to put us in a very good position to start bending these limbs and tillering this bow. If we can get this thing perfectly parallel all the way down, the same thickness all the way down, theoretically it should bend evenly at that point because our limbs are tapered from wide to narrow nocks. We're still off of our line here just a little bit, 1/16 of an inch or so. I'm going to go ahead and move to the rasp and get these edges right down to the line. But what a lot of people want to do is they see that line, they want to get to it quickly, and so they put their tool at a very steep angle like that because you can get to the line very quickly that way, but you're not really doing anything, you're not removing any material. And so what you need to do is pick an angle for your tool that's going to get whatever wood you're removing, you want to go all the way to the middle of the limb. So that's an angle about like that. So when you start this, avoid coming at it like this, because if you do that, you're just going to take a very little off the side. You need to bring that slope in so that you end up with another ridge running down the middle. We'll get this side right on down to the line, then we'll come to this side and bring that to the line. Another tip I'll give you is when you're rasping, make sure that you go from the outside of the limb in, because if you go the other way, if you go this way, you're going to pull splinters off the side, and then you're going to have to deal with that later. So keep an eye on those lines on the edges of your limb. Make sure that you don't go below those because, like I said, this 3/8, your limb's going to end up being a little bit thinner than this, but not a whole lot. You don't have a lot of tolerance here, so be very careful. So here's our line right here. We're going to bring this wood right on down to the edge of it, making sure that our angle on our tool is not too steep. All right, so that's pretty good. So now I'm going to go ahead and just take this thing. Right now we've got this peak running down the middle. We've got a little hump in it. I'm going to go ahead and just flatten that out side to side, making sure that, you know, if I'm focusing on this side, making sure that I'm not going down below on this side. So you got to keep an eye on both. So that limb is pretty good. The belly side is pretty flat. Now we need to move to this side and do the same thing. Pretty good. All right, so at this point, we've got our sides are parallel, they're straight up and down. Our belly side is pretty much flat, and we've got something that's really starting to look like a bow, and it should start to bend a little bit. So our limbs right now in the middle are probably still close to a 1/2 inch because we have that little crown on the back, but the sides are right about 3/8. So if we put the tip on the ground and push it, you can see we're getting some nice flex to it. And so I can see right now that we've got a nice smooth bend from the riser to the nock, and that's exactly what you want. If you see anywhere that it looks like it's weak, or where it looks like you're getting an angle in your bend, you want to stop, you want to mark that spot because that's a weak spot. And if you have a weak spot, that's called a hinge, you need to take wood off of everywhere else to catch it up with that. We're going to talk more about that when we talk more about tillering. All right, so at this point, we could go a couple of different directions. We could just go ahead and move straight into the tillering process. We could finish this bow off and just have a raw hickory flat bow. Now, if you are just getting into bow building, if this is your first bow or maybe your first couple of bows, that's probably the route that I would recommend, that you just move straight into tillering and go with a raw bow. The problem with doing that is that hickory, although it's a great beginner's bow wood because it is so tough, it's so durable, it does have a tendency to take what is called set. So when you draw a bow, you're compressing the wood on the belly. And hickory, a raw hickory bow, doesn't resist that compression very well. And so when you draw that bow and stress all of that wood on the belly side, it compresses it and it doesn't spring back the way that a very nice or efficient bow would. And so you get set, or it stays bent. You don't want that in a bow. But if this is your first bow or your first couple bows, like I said, so what? It doesn't matter. You're trying to get a functional bow. If it has a little bit of set, it doesn't matter. You're going to get better over time as you build more bows. The other way that we could go is that we could heat treat the belly, which is going to harden the belly and make it more resistant to compression and less likely to take set. Another way to refer to set is string follow. It basically, when you unstring this bow, it's going to stay kind of in that strung or braced position. It's not going to spring back all the way like it is right now with the limb tips forward of the handle. That's the route that I'm going to go with this bow. But if you are new, if this is your first bow, I would probably recommend that you skip this step and just move straight. Just pick this up when we start tillering this thing again. So what we're going to do is move over here. I've got a jig or a form that I've made that is, we're going to clamp this thing to, and it's going to put in back set. Basically what it is, it's a long board that I've got. We're going to clamp this thing to it, and it's going to push these limbs down, which is going to make these limb tips rest farther forward of the handle. We're going to clamp it into that position. We're going to take a heat gun, and we're going to cook the belly side of this, which is going to drive out all the moisture, and it's going to harden this belly wood, and it's going to make this a more efficient bow. So let's get started with that. Here's what we got going on. Got my form here. All this is like a 2x6. It's got about a 20-inch flat in the middle, and then the ends just slope off. I'm going to clamp this down back towards the form, so belly side up. These forms are easy to make. I get questions all the time about how to make them. There's nothing to it. Take you a 2x6, take a piece of PVC pipe or something else that's flexible, it's got a nice bend to it. Secure the ends, pull it this way, trace the bends out, cut it out, and rasp it off to smooth, and you're good to go. All right, so we've got this thing on our form here. Now what I'm going to do is take my heat gun. Doesn't matter what kind of heat gun you get. You can get ones with variable heat dials on the side. This is just a plain old Wagner, probably cost 25 bucks at Home Depot. You don't need an expensive heat gun. You control your heat not by the dial on the side, but by how far you are from the wood and how fast you're moving. And so I'm going to set a timer, and for each one of these limbs, I'm going to heat them for about half an hour. I'm going to maintain about an inch or so of space between the end of my heat gun and this limb, and I'm just going to keep moving like this, back and forth, back and forth until your 30 minutes is up. I'm gonna do this one for 30 minutes, and I'm gonna move to this one. And then once we're done, you're gonna start seeing, just maybe 10, 15 minutes in, you're gonna start seeing this wood darken. That's fine. We don't wanna scorch the wood or burn the wood, but we do wanna see a little bit of a color change. Another thing that you might see happen is, if you look closely, if the wood has a relatively high moisture content, I'd say above maybe 10, 12%, you might start seeing some tiny little cracks open up with the grain in here. That's fine, don't worry about that. Those are superficial. I'm gonna start a timer and start heating. So about this speed is what you want. Back and forth. It's gonna take you a while. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the camera, and I'm gonna pick you guys up on the back side of this, and then we'll continue on with the process. All right, so we've got the heat treat done. I've spent 30 minutes heating each one of these limbs, and I actually went a little bit shallower than what I had recommended, my 1-inch recommendation. I was, for most of the time, I was somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch, just slowly moving back and forth across these limbs. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this thing out of the form. And I did end up adding another clamp here to the center, because this stave had just a little bit of a roll to it. And when you pull this thing out, you should come up with something like this. Now, what this bend away from the belly and towards the back, this is called back set. This is going to give you a more efficient bow, because basically it preloads the limbs with tension. When you bend these limbs down and have a string on this thing, and this bow is braced, it takes much more energy just to get the bow to that braced position. And so when you go to draw, you're already starting from a higher draw weight. And so you're gonna have a much faster, much more efficient bow if you start out with a profile, with a side profile like this with back set, than if you do, if you're starting off with a bow with straight limbs, or the opposite end of the spectrum, a bow with set or string follow, where you actually have the opposite bend, or a bend that is towards the string or the belly side of the bow. That would be inefficient. So now what we can do is, let's go ahead and just see what we've got here. Put that on the ground and bend a little bit. Now that added a lot of weight to it. So what we're going to end up doing is, first thing I'm going to do before I do anything else is I'm going to take these sharp edges off of where the side meets the back. I'm just kind of run a scraper or a file across that, just to kind of radius that out just a little bit and take that sharp edge off. And then we're going to start taking some wood off the belly so that we can reduce the weight a little bit and get this thing bending just a little bit more. While I've got this thing in my vise, I'm going to go ahead and take this knock section, so about the last 8 inches or so of this limb, and really round this off so we can get ready to cut our knocks in. So we've got the edges on the back rounded off just a little bit. Got the tips rounded over right here so that we can file our knocks in there when we get ready to do that. Just want to put this thing on the ground and bend on it a little bit and see what she looks like. Now what we're looking for is a nice smooth bend and evenness from side to side. That's pretty good. All right, so at this point we are ready to move into the meat and potatoes of bow building, and that is tillering. So tillering refers to removing wood from stiff areas of these limbs to make the limbs bend evenly side to side, and then also make the limbs bend on a nice smooth arc. And so we're looking for stiff spots, we're looking for weak spots, and if we have a weak spot, we need to mark that spot so we don't remove any more wood from there, and then we're going to have to remove wood from everywhere else to catch it up to that. Now we want to do everything we can to try to avoid that type of situation where we're fixing problems, and that's why I had you spend so much time setting this thing up with a rectangular cross section and making sure everything is even, making sure your edges are even from riser to the nocks. If you didn't do a good job there and setting this thing up, you're going to go into the tillering process already having to correct problems. So go back, watch that section of this video again, and make sure that you set everything up properly. And if you do that, if you've got a nice smooth taper, if everything's tapered out right and even, it's going to make the tillering go a whole lot smoother. So right now, if you did everything correctly, you should have a nice smooth bend from riser to nock, and everything should be relatively even side to side. So right now I've got that, but the bow is still way too heavy. Right now this bow, if I could get a string on it, it's probably pulling close to 100 pounds. And so what we need to do is start removing wood from the belly side of this bow to lower weight on this thing, but we also have to keep an eye on our tiller from side to side, making sure things are even, and then also that we've got a nice smooth arc over these limbs. And so what I'm going to do is turn this thing belly side up. I'm going to turn my draw knife up, and I'm going to start using this as a scraper. And because we've already got things set up right, everything's even from nock to riser, I'm going to take long, even strokes off of this thing so that we don't dig any holes and have to correct those problems later. So I'm not gonna start scraping like this, little scrapes like that, because that's gonna make a thin spot in the limb. I wanna make a long, even stroke all the way down this thing. Now, one thing I want to warn you of, at this point, if you are using one of these benches, or even if you're at a vise and have this thing in there, as you get closer to yourself, people have a tendency to roll their tools over, right in here. And so what that's going to do is you're going to get a thin spot on this side of your limb. That's no good. You want to avoid that. So make sure you keep an eye that your tool is even and level and mirroring whatever your limb's doing. So if you have a limb that has a little bit of a roll to it, you've got to mirror that with your tool, because if your limb is tilted just a little bit and you have a flat tool, you're going to end up making a thin spot on one side. You got to keep things even. Pay attention. So that was 10 pretty heavy strokes on this limb. I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other. All right, so that took a little bit of weight off. Might be getting close to getting a string on it. So I'm going to go ahead and file the nocks in here, and then we can go ahead and put a very loose tillering string on here and put it up on the tillering rack. So the main thing you want to watch out for on your nocks is that your shoulders right here where the nock comes out and meets with the back, you want to make sure that there's not a sharp edge right there, because that'll actually cut your bowstring. So you want to kind of round that out a little bit. Don't round it too far into the back, but just kind of round those off kind of this way. All right, so I've got both nocks cut in. Now I'm just going to go ahead and put a long string on this thing. And we're going to go over here to the tillering rack. I'll show you how I've got that constructed. We'll just stick this thing up there, pull on it a little bit, and just see how it bends. All right, so the tillering setup that I've got here is very nice. I prefer this type of setup. I've got a cradle on the wall here about head high, and then down here at the bottom I've got a pulley. I've got a rope running through that. And so what we're going to do is stick this bow right up here. We're going to put our pulley rope on here. Now when you have a bow with a bunch of back set like this, a lot of times it wants to flip, and so you may end up having to stick something in here to kind of brace this thing so that it doesn't flip. Pull it down enough to get it down under your rack right there, and then you're good to go. So now what this allows us to do is grab hold to our rope, back up here, pull it, and then we can get an eye on the bend left and right, and then side to side from back here. All right, so to start with, the first big thing I see is this limb right here. When I pull it down like this one's straightening out. This one still has quite a bit of reflex right in here, so I want to make this limb match this one. So this is a stiff spot. I want to go ahead and just take my scraper and take a little bit out of this section of this limb right there, and that's going to allow this limb tip to come down just a little bit and match this side. Doesn't take much, probably just a few scrapes. All right, so this is that stiff section of this limb. So I'm just going to turn my draw knife up about a 90 to the limb. Take about 10 good scrapes off of here. Round those edges back out just a little bit. We'll put it back up here, see what that did. Yeah. Probably take another 10 or 15 off of right in here. Yeah, it looks good. That looks much more even. All right, so you notice that I'm doing this incrementally, a little bit at a time. At this point, it's very easy to take a stiff spot and make it into a weak spot. If you take too much wood off there, you can't put it back on. If this area right here was kind of stiff, if I get impatient and start just hogging off wood, I'm gonna make this into a weak spot. And the only way to fix that is to remove wood from everywhere else to make it match this weak spot. If you leave a weak spot in a bow, over time, you might get away with it at first, but over time, each time you shoot that bow, that place has to work just a little bit harder than everywhere else, and eventually it'll weaken and could potentially form a crack there, break. but it's a situation that you want to try to avoid. So in the tillering process, the name of the game here is to take a little bit off, put it back up here and check it, go back to the scraper, take a little bit more off, check it, and just move very, very slowly like that. Do not get impatient with this, because if you do, you're going to end up messing something up, and you're going to end up with a 15 or 20 pound bow. And that's very common with new bowyers, is to end up with a bow that's much, much lighter than your target draw weight. Because they do that, they end up making a weak spot, and then they have to remove wood from everywhere else to catch it up with that weak spot. That's how you get there. That's how you get to those 15 or 20 pound bows. So go slow, take a little bit off, check it, take a little bit off, and check it. So we've got this limb pretty well matching this one. At this point, the bow is still pretty doggone heavy. Now, if you have one, or if you plan on making more than just one or two bows, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you get a scale and put right here between your bowstring and your pull rope. That's gonna help you to get a feel for how heavy your bow is, or how much weight you're putting on your bow. I don't have a scale in this because, as I said before, I'm trying to do this with a very minimal toolkit, so I'm just doing this by feel. But like I said, if you're going to be building more than one or two bows, get a scale. You can get them from Three Rivers, or I don't know what they cost. A fish scale would work just fine, so that when you pull on this, you can tell how many pounds of pressure you're putting on this bowstring. So what I'm going to do is take this off here. I'm going to take a little bit more off of both limbs, since we've got things even right now. I'm going to take them off both limbs, the whole thing, and then I'm going to just try to reduce the weight a little bit, keeping things even from side to side. I'll put it back up here, and our objective right now is to get these limb tips down to about right here. If I can get these limb tips down to about right here without being way high on the weight, without being way above my target draw weight, then we're going to be in a position to put a short string on it, or to brace this thing, and that's when things really start speeding up. Then once you get a short string on it and the bow is braced, you're just about done. So I'm going to take this, put it back on the shave horse, take a little bit off each side, and stick it back up here. All right, so these nice feathery, these kind of papery scrapes, that's what you're after. If you can get scrapes like that, you're actually doing something. You get little wispy stuff like this, you're not really doing a whole lot right there. So put a little bit of pressure, make sure you've got a good sharp scraper, and keep track of how many scrapes you do per limb, because right now everything's even. We want to keep everything even. So I'm going to take off maybe 10 scrapes off this one. I'll flip it around, take off 10 off the other side. We'll put it back up there and see what we've got. Those pigeons up there are in love. It's looking pretty good. We're almost there. I think we're still just a wee bit stiff on our left side. I can tell that this one right in here is not flattening out quite as much as that. So maybe just a little bit, maybe 3 or 4 more scrapes right in here. So it's very slight, but this limb's just a little bit stiffer. You can see that when I pull it down, this limb starts to round over just a little bit. And this one just kind of straightens out a little bit. So I'm going to take a little more off right here, and that should bring this limb down to match this one. All right, so we've got it back up on the tillering rack. So here's what I did. I took off 5 scrapes from everything, from here to here, here to here, and then I took off an additional 3 right in this area to try to get this limb to round out a little bit to match that one. So we'll stand back and give it just a little pull and see what we've got. Bam, getting close. That is pretty close. I think we could probably get a short string on that now. Right now the bow is pretty even side to side as far as I can tell with this short string or this long string on there. It's kind of hard to tell with a long string, but when we shorten this string up and brace this bow, if there's any imbalance from side to side or any weak spots in the limbs, it's really going to make those things stand out. So we're just going to take this string that I've got here, and I've got in the end here, I've got just a timber hitch or bowyer's knot, some people call it. And I'm just going to take this. I think I have a video on YouTube showing you how to tie this thing. If not, there should be something on Patreon. All right, so it should be pretty evident what's going on here. This limb is a little bit stronger, this limb's a little bit weaker, but within these limbs, this section right here is going to be your weak spot. This right in here is a little bit stiff, and same here, this is a little bit stiff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little squiggly mark on my weak spots. This right here is not quite a weak spot, but it would turn into one if I took off more wood. I'll mark that too. And then for my stiff spots, I'll put some long lines this way so that I'll know where to remove the wood and where to leave the wood. So at this point, go slow. Take off just a little bit, come back and check. Because if you take off too much at this point, and it doesn't take much, and I'm talking just 2 or 3 scrapes too much. You take off too much somewhere, you're going to end up with this weak spot, and you're going to have to chase that, and then you're going to end up with a light bow. So I'm going to go ahead and unstring this and fix this. Oh, man. So again, just removing wood from the stiff spots. So when I'm stringing this thing, don't just string it up and look at it. You need to stress the limb a little bit. So put a little pressure on there. And that's looking much better. Still a little stiff right in here. Mark that. If you look down, one good way to figure out if you're on a nice radius or not, if you look down the limb, you can see that this area right here, pretty flat. It's bending a little bit right in here. It's bending a little bit right here. This one's flat. Take this limb on the other hand. Got a lot of bend here, pretty flat right in here, and not a lot here, just a little bit of bend here. So here's your weak spot. See how that doesn't match this radius of the limb. It should blend nicely into the limb. This area right in here still giving me a little trouble, but it's not bad, not too bad. Let's see here. Pull it up, put it up here, give it a little pull, see what she does. Now, when you're pulling these bows on this tillering rack, you want to pull it just until you see a problem. If you see a problem, don't keep wrenching on it. Don't keep trying to get it down to your draw length. If you see a problem, go ahead and address that problem and then bring it back up here and start working it down to your draw length. So this is 24, 26, 28. We're trying to get it just past 28. So I'm a little bit stiff right in here. So I'm just gonna take a few scrapes off that with my pocket knife. Still pretty heavy. It's probably 70 pounds at 29 right now or more. All right, so I'm gonna unstring this bow, take a few more heavy scrapes off of everywhere except this one weak spot. Try to reduce this weight down a little bit, and then we'll put it back up on the rack. Okay. So at this point, I'm just kind of slowly working these limbs down. You don't want to just go ahead and reef it on down to your full draw. Just kind of work it down slowly. Give those limbs a chance to settle into their bend. So we're about 25 inches now. $26.5 or so. It's about 27. So that's 28 right there. All right, so we're at 28 inches. Everything's looking pretty good. I'm just gonna draw it by hand and just see what it feels like. Yeah, it's probably 60 pounds. Right now at 29, I'm not drawing it quite to 29. Pretty nice. All right, so now what we're gonna do is go ahead and shape the handle up. We'll cut our shelf in there, we'll sand everything down, seal it up, and we'll be ready to rock and roll. All right, so I mentioned earlier that we could flip this thing over, end over end, to give us some more flexibility on what's the top and bottom limb. But how do you know? How do you know what you want to be the top and what you want to be the bottom? So what I do, go ahead and stress the bow, let it settle into the bend that it's going to take, and then I take a look at the measurement from the string to the belly of the bow just outside of the risers. And what I'm looking for is a slightly larger gap on the top limb. We've got just a very slight more distance on this limb than we do this limb. And so this is going to be the top limb. That's called positive tiller. All right, so the handle here, you can shape this thing however you want, contour it to your handle. I'm going to show you how I do it, but you guys do it however you want, whatever feels the best to you. Make sure you know what's the top limb, what's the bottom. First thing I'm going to do is start by just rounding this belly side off of this handle. I'm going to take these corners off. Now I'm going to come to the back side here, round this off a little. pretty nice. So now what I'm going to do is come right up here to where the top of our handle was when we originally marked it out. So that's top, here's the bottom. Bring that all the way around. Now I like to kind of neck mine down right in here and dish it out so that my hand fits in there really nice. So I'm going to take a half round rasp, line it up with top of that line. All right. I like the way that feels. Now at this point, you don't have to cut a shelf in there. I like to personally, so I'm gonna go ahead and show you how to do that. But like I said, if you don't want to cut a shelf in there, skip this step. So the top of our line right here, I'm just gonna take the edge of my farrier's rasp and just go straight down. And I'm actually gonna slope this thing towards the front just a little bit, so that when you put the arrow on the shelf, the balance point is kind of towards the back of the handle. Just personal preference. All right, so I've marked out with my rasp where my shelf is going to go. And I'm just going to go ahead and take a little pull saw, cut down just little ways, maybe a 1/4 inch or so. Now we're going to come back with our chisel and work from here down using that cut that we made as a stop. All right, shelf is cut. Now we may need to make some small adjustments to this once we get the string on there, put an arrow on, see how it aligns. We may need to bring the back in just a little bit or the front, but that is pretty much done. So I went ahead and put a short string on this thing. This is a string that's made for a bow this length. I'm gonna stick this arrow on there and it lines up good with the shelf. We don't have to make any adjustments. If it was kicked off one way or the other, you just have to take out some out of the front or the back just to make it sit in there pretty well. I'm gonna go ahead and tie a knock on there and we will be ready to go shoot this thing. Now if you don't know how to tie a knock, I think I did a video a while back showing you how to do these things. Maybe it's on Patreon, I don't remember. Pretty easy. Lots of tutorials online. Not going to worry about a bow square at this point. Just going to kind of eyeball it. Looks about right. I've got a test kit here with a bunch of different arrows in it. Everywhere from 40, 45 to up to like 80, 85 shafts. The bows that I make tend to need an arrow that's spined a bit higher. than the draw weight. So I'm going to look for, say, a 60-65 or something like that. And that should, there's one right there. That should be fairly close enough anyway. I did a video, if you're interested, I did a video on how to select the proper arrows for a bow, because having the bow matched with the arrows, or the arrows matched with the bow, is very, very important. I'll link to that in the video somewhere. Put a little piece of paper there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 yards. And we'll see if we can hit that thing. First shot, hickory selfbow. Step back here and draw it once so you can see what it looks like. There's no shelf material on this thing at all. Normally I'd put Velcro or something soft on there. All right, let's give her a whirl. Not too bad. This arrow is underspined for this bow. It's going to need a much heavier arrow. So I don't know if you could see that or not, but the arrow came off and kicked way knock left. And if you don't know what I'm talking about there, I actually did a video not long ago on tuning longbows and recurves. It's actually about tuning the arrows to the bow, which is very informative if you have any questions on that, why the arrows do that and how to correct it. And so this is a 60-65 shaft. I'll probably need a, oh, I don't know, 70-75 maybe. I'm not getting this thing quite to full draw. And if you watch my elbow, you can see it's a little bit forward because it's a little bit heavier. This bow is probably 60 pounds or so. I've been shooting a bow that's a little over 50. I'm going to try to go ahead and wrench it on back this time. Hitting in the same spot every time. Just need to spend some time with it and get some shelf material on there. That'll influence how the arrows fly as well. Super harsh, just shooting straight off the wood like this. Now, this bow is done. Now, I actually did a video last year or maybe the year before on doing all the finish work, the sanding, the sealing, putting the Velcro on the strike plate and the shelf and all of that stuff. So I'm not going to cover that in this video. I'll link to that at the end of this one and also in the video description so you can check that out. But sucker's done and it shoots good. I like it. It shoots quick, it shoots hard, and it shoots a little bit higher than where I'm looking, but it wouldn't take me long to get dialed in. And if I get the opportunity, I might take this thing out after hogs this winter. All right, not too bad, just a couple inches above where I'm aiming. But I hope you guys enjoyed this bow building video. I hadn't done one in quite a while, but I was writing the article, taking pictures, so I figured I'd knock a video out at the same time. But I like it. It's a nice shooting bow. It shoots fast, it shoots hard, and it is shooting a little bit higher than what I'm used to, but that's fine. Spend a little bit of time with this thing, and it wouldn't take me long at all to get that dialed in. So if you like the video, go ahead and subscribe and hit that like, leave me a comment, and I might, if I get the opportunity and get this thing dialed in, I might do some hog hunting with it this winter. So we'll see you guys on the next one.